Welcome to this event by Festivaletteratura. We are talking about the last book of Judith Butler, which is an American philosopher. I am Maura Gancitano. I am a philosopher too. And I live in Italy, and my company is Tlon, which is a philosophical project. Now we are talking about the last book of Judith Butler, which is La forza della non violenza in Italian, published by Nottetempo. This is, in my opinion, an important book. And Butler, you start your book with this sentence: nonviolence is one of those issues that encounter cross-cutting skeptical reactions across the entire political spectrum. Why do you think this happens? Does it depend on the way our society is built, or by the way we understand social claims and conflicts? And is there a chance to change this perception?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and in conversation with you. I very much appreciate the invitation. It seems to me that when the topic of nonviolence is raised, there is always someone who will say, "Oh, that's so impractical. It doesn't make sense as a politics. It's an idealism. It's an impossibility." So people who talk seriously about nonviolence are understood to be unserious politically. Now, I think few people would say that about Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, and they would not have said that, I think, about Martin Luther King Jr., both of whom led major civil rights movements, strikes, boycotts that were enormously consequential, fighting British colonialism in the case of Gandhi, and fighting segregation, racial segregation in the case of King. And yet, as much as we applaud those movements, and I believe many people, especially on the left, have great respect for them, even if they don't agree with everything about them, it is nevertheless the case that nonviolence is understood as an impractical form of idealism for our times. And I believe when people say it's impractical, that means that they don't see a way to practice it. If they call it unrealistic, that means it does not comport with our established ideas of reality. So the way to answer it, I think, is to explain what the practice is. For instance, many people are very much in favor of strikes, or they see the importance of the strike as part of the labor movement, as part of the feminist movement. Now that we have a feminist strike that has a transnational dimension. But they don't always think, well, strikes are a nonviolent strategy. Boycotts are the same. I mean, how did the world bring down apartheid in South Africa? The sanctions against South Africa were enormous, and they were enormously consequential, and they were nonviolent means of affecting political change. So many of the complaints about nonviolence seem to disregard the actual political accomplishments of nonviolent movements.
The attempt of this book you wrote is to graft psychoanalysis with moral philosophy and social theory, suggesting that some of our ethical and political debates presuppose tacit democratic assumptions. In this perspective, you are able to make dialogue Frantz Fanon and Michel Foucault, Achille Mbembe and Walter Benjamin, as never done before. Does this come from what has happened and continues to happen in the United States, even if you published this book in the United States in February 2020?
Well, as you know, I'm trained in continental philosophy and literary theory, and yet I am situated in the United States, and my politics is to some degree an engagement with U.S. Political issues, although I'm very engaged with European issues, and I've been traveling to Latin America and South Africa and Japan and China in the last years, when I used to travel, when travel was possible. So I am interested in trans-regional movements, and I am also interested in trying to show that the forms of critical thought that emerge from continental theory do not necessarily stay restricted to Europe as a continent or even as an idea. I think Mbembe is an example. He is trained in the work of Frantz Fanon, but certainly knows psychoanalysis, knows the background in Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and there are certainly others who are
Thomas Hobbes, Immanuel Kant.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And yet he takes it in another direction and makes it live. And one could perhaps say the same about Gayatri Spivak, given her grounding in European literary criticism. But I think that my view has always been that to think well, I need to have several interlocutors. I don't belong to a single school. And in that way, I'm not European. And my eclecticism is very American. I understand that. But I wonder, you read Fanon, you see what he does, it's very important. But can Fanon tell me about law? Well, probably not. Benjamin can tell me about law, but can he tell me about law in a way that complements what Fanon is saying about the racial schema in which Black bodies are perceived and treated under conditions of racism? So it makes sense to think creatively and collaboratively. I tend to collaborate with the dead, it seems, except for Achille and a few other people, to think collaboratively with these different frameworks to see what can be produced by allowing them to supplement each other. No one framework can answer all questions.
When I read this book, it seems to me that you have the urgency to bring philosophy to deal with the Greek questions of this time. Is it true? Because in your opinion, academic philosophy around the world protects itself from a reflection on current events, especially on what concerns the way in which so many human beings are treated. So inequality, for example.
Yes. Well, to be fair, philosophy is a complex discipline, and I tend to work on the outside of the discipline. It's true, but there's a great deal of work done on philosophy and human rights, on applied ethics. Philosophy and bioethics is an important field. So I mean, philosophy does have its interdisciplinary sites, which I think are very promising and very important.
Philosophy as a future.
Well, it may be that its future is interdisciplinary,
yes,
which
I think so.
I think is important.
I think it's a bridge between disciplines.
Yes, perhaps so. But I also think that the tradition of critical theory that comes out of the Frankfurt School, it was philosophy, but it was also sociology. It was also aesthetics. It was several different fields at the same time. And they were looking at rising fascism and saying, well, what can we as thinkers do to take into account this condition of emergent fascism in the 30s and then full-blown fascism in the late 30s and 40s? How do we imagine what philosophy is, such that it can respond to historical events, to historical processes, to large social patterns, the domination by technology, the problem of fascism in aesthetic forms. What is it that compels people? Where are the signs of hope today? Right? I mean, I'm not sure we have an Ernst Bloch for the present, but we should. and I think that that philosophical thought can draw our attention to what is happening in current events and in our historical times, if it agrees to take as its texts popular expressions and newspaper articles and films and popular culture. In other words, it has to engage with the historical world in order to allow its thought to change, but also to clarify what it thinks is actually happening. You know, what are the prevailing ideas of equality that we find in popular and public life? What are the prevailing ideas of the human or of nature? All of these are enormously important for the struggles for racial equality and gender equality, the struggle to stop the destruction of the planet. We need these concepts. We use these concepts without quite, reflecting on what we mean or clarifying what we should mean, what the ideal form or the normative form of those concepts might be.
And in this book, you talk about a huge problem, which is the dignity of mourning, because in our society, systemic inequality leads to considering only some human lives worthy of mourning, and therefore worthy of values. How can the force of nonviolence be, in the sense, a bodily affirmation of life and also of the dignity of mourning?
Yes. Well, when we talk about whose life is grievable and whose life is not, I know this term grievable is difficult to translate. We're really talking about what life, when and where would it matter if a life were lost? There's a subjunctive or hypothetical character to that speculation. If you live in this world and you feel like, my life could be taken at a moment's notice and nobody would care, or maybe only my family would care, but the rest of the world would not care, or maybe my family wouldn't care, only my one friend, or maybe my one friend wouldn't care. I mean, that's a sense of living as someone whose loss would not matter, right? That pervades the sense of a life. I am not a valuable being. If I were to die from COVID or die from violence, or die from neglect, right? The neglect of a public policy, it would not matter. And that's a terrible way to live, right? That's living as a being who has the sense that that they have no value in the eyes of the world. Now, they may have value in their own eyes, or there may be a community or even a political community for whom they do have value. And so then it's a struggle. Like, yes, my life is grievable, which means my life is worth living and worth protecting and worth safeguarding, and I should have health care and I should have shelter. And I should not be sent to a war in which I'm sacrificed, and I should not be gunned down by police on the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin, or wherever the police are killing people of color today. So I think that when we talk about social inequality, we're not just talking about people are unequally treated by the law or by institutions. We're also saying that some people are treated as more grievable, more valuable, and less grievable, less valuable. And, it's not the same as saying, oh, I'm treated as an inferior being. and this person is treated as superior, because we're both then living beings. This one's superior, this one's inferior. This one who's superior is also treated as someone whose life is worth something. And I am treated as if my life is dispensable and not particularly worth marking, noting, acknowledging. So there's a sense of being a passing or a transient life, unmarked and unmourned, that is part of a living experience. It's the question of grievability is not just how we treat the dead. It is, for sure. Some populations are more overtly mourned than others when they perish. And that's the demographic inequality we see in the politics of public mourning. But we're also talking about a phenomenological sense of not being regarded as a living being whose life is worth living, and that's different. That's a slightly different perspective on inequality. But I do believe that grievability should be part of any definition of social inequality that we have.
And in your opinion, how people who has privilege could act something in this society full of inequalities? What about privilege?
Well, privilege is a function of inequality and of a hierarchical system, right? And maybe the question there is how is privilege distributed? Who gets privilege and how do they acquire it, and who never has access to privilege, or who loses privilege under certain conditions. But I worry a little bit that the language of privilege makes it sound like it's an attribute of the person, when actually it's part of a distribution of value that belongs to a larger problem of equality and inequality. But I would say, perhaps to circle back to an earlier question, when we look at the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, these public assemblies, these major gatherings of people, they are asserting the value of lives that are too often destroyed through poverty or illness, through being blocked from economic opportunities, or being denied health care, but also police violence, or the violence of white supremacists who feel quite emboldened by both police violence and the rhetoric of the Trump administration. So they are dying. The Black and brown communities here in the US, they are dying in greater numbers, and they're also being shot on the street. So it's that convergence which, in some sense, brought so many people out on the street to say, these lives matter. I would say that those assemblies are also acts of public mourning. Like, I'm going to name each of those people who were shot. They had value. They deserve to be mourned. They ought not to have died. Their deaths were preventable. Their deaths were an injustice. So it's both a political demand to change society so that every life does matter, another impractical and idealistic proposition, but also to mourn the ones that have lost, because it's precisely the erasure of the loss which is so deeply, deeply painful and offensive to so many people.
Nonviolence, you wrote, is a practice of resistance that becomes possible, if not imperative, just when resorting to violence seems most justified and obvious. In this sense, you reconnect with great experiences, for example, Mahatma Gandhi. How can these characters still represent a reference point for thought and practice?
Well, I think the history of nonviolence is perhaps most well known as centering on the work of Gandhi, and Gandhi is enormously important. There's no question about that. But I don't think we should look just there. I think we should also look to existing social practices. How how is nonviolence being practiced now? It may be drawing from Gandhi, and I think it is, and it may be drawing from King, and it may be drawing from other Buddhist traditions, which also has a very strong tradition of nonviolence. I think we can ask, and we are asking, certainly on the left here, and I know it's been part of the history of the Italian left, this question, right? Do we or do we not need violence as an instrument to oppose capitalism, to oppose fascism, to oppose radical inequality and radical injustice? And this question will always be posed. I don't imagine that question is going to go away. But I think the way to approach it is to have some sympathy for the desire for violence. In other words, yes, there's something in me like would like to fight, to find a violent solution to contemporary politics. I understand that, but it's the question is, what do I do with that passion or that urge or that desire? Do I let it unfold? Or do I transform it or even cultivate that rage, that aggression, into a kind of practice that produces, in the end, a less violent world? Because my sense is that we can't say, oh, violence is just a means for achieving a nonviolent world, because the minute it's used as the means, as the instrument, it takes on a life of its own, and it sets a precedent. Yes, violence is good as an instrument. So you can't say it is legitimate to use violence as an instrument, and then say to others who use it, oh, it's illegitimate when you use it. Even though there are distinct forms of violence. I mean, state violence is different from the violence of resistance. I don't deny that, but there's also the violence of right-wing resistance to the state, and we're seeing some of that here. And I know you know that well in Italy as well. So my answer is, we can collectively work on the rage to produce all kinds of things. We can produce art from rage. We can produce solidarity from rage. We can produce boycotts and strikes from rage. We can stop production from rage. Right? Stopping production is, we can deplatform. These are contemporary nonviolent methods that can be very powerful and can speak to us in the present.
In your books, you wrote about it. You draw what the society brings to us, social conditioning, social constrictions. In this book, you wrote, you are not born as an individual. Yeah. And even if you become so over time, no one can escape the essential condition of dependence. This is not a negative thing, it's a positive thing. And it is an important Weltanschauung, an important vision of the world and scenario of this time, this actual present time. Anyone, regardless of their political positions in the present, comes into the world in a condition of radical dependence. So how is this addictive condition a condition of strength and freedom, and can it help us to overcome individualism?
Well, let me say that, I mean, this point has been part of feminist philosophy, feminist readings of psychoanalysis, feminist film theory, feminist psychology for a very long time, right? And for the most part, it has focused on the maternal, that we are born of women and we are dependent on women, and that it's that dependency on women and the work they do that is systematically denied in the making of the masculine individual, right? And in fact, the way you become a masculine individual is to deny your dependency, even as you continue to have that dependency. You never overcome it, right? You deny it and you sustain it. and it's that ambivalence which is directed towards women, which makes, I gather, from what I hear, heterosexuality a rather fraught arena. But I want to say that yes, dependency on the mother is important, and I know how important that's been, especially for psychoanalytic perspectives and for many sexual difference feminists. But mothers are also dependent on many social structures. The organization of work, including domestic labor, the organization of childcare, the organization of the distribution of food, the accessibility of food, the affordability of shelter, the accessibility and affordability of healthcare. In other words, the zones of dependency, even for the mother on whom we are ostensibly dependent, are vast. And that allows us to move beyond the figure of the mother, maybe to social institutions upon which we depend, and which we have to think about explicitly. How are they organized? Are they organized fairly? Are they organized in a just fashion? Do people have equal access? Who participates? Who decides what form they take? There are massive social and political questions that pertain to these institutions and practices on which we're all dependent in order to live and to live well. And we know that now under conditions of pandemic. Like Italy in the early stages of the pandemic, the US has been dealing with hospitals that are overcrowded, people who have no access to healthcare, people who fear the healthcare system, maybe because of their immigration status or because they've experienced discrimination there. And queer and trans people are very worried about going to healthcare centers where they don't know they will be treated with respect, or and that their illness will be hand treated well. So these are issues that really pertain to either a basic idea of social democracy. What would a social democracy be in which the services on which we depend for life, for living on, for living well, were equally available to everyone? I think we probably need a more radical conception of democratic socialism in order to really answer the question, how would the basic services on which we depend to live be organized equally and justly? And I think, it also extends to the question of the environment. We depend on the environment to live, but the environment also depends on us not to toxify it, to safeguard it, to affirmatively safeguard it, and to safeguard its living creatures and its living processes. So the zones of dependency are not they're not signs of weakness. They're signs of connectedness. They're signs of social and ecological relationality, which seek to understand the value of life as something that depends upon equal and just systems of social and economic organization. So I think that by affirming this notion of dependency, we're not just individuals, we belong to each other, we're dependent on each other and on the world, both in its social and environmental dimensions. And that makes us a part of things that we otherwise would not be. We're more connected. We might have struggles and conflicts in those zones of connection, in alliances and in forms of solidarity. But that we need them to live. We must be social to live.
For this reason, the subtitle of this book is An Ethical Political Bind. And bind, it seems a negative thing, but it's positive and it's connected with solidarity. No, and in this book, you talk about a ghost. You wrote the police officer who decides to shoot or who simply says is forced to do so may or may not do so intentionally. Surely, however, it seems that there is a rational ghost presiding over his evaluations, who overturns the figures and movements in order to justify any lethal action he may perform. I think about Hannah Arendt and Adolf Eichmann, for example. You talk about this ghost. What are the ghosts that affect our actions and the gaze we have in society?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know what the Italian translation is, but in the English, it's phantasm. A phantasm, fantasma. I don't know.
Phantasma. From the Greek, ta phantasmata.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. And I do think, and it comes out when white policemen say in a court of law, well, this guy was threatening my life, and then we see the video, and this guy who was shot to death was actually running in the other direction, did not have a weapon. It's like, how was that person running that way, threatening your life? His back was to you. He said he was about to turn around. He was about to kill me. He is this figure of uncontrollable violence. And then you see that this white policeman is operating with a phantasm of the black man as a figure of uncontrollable violence, right? We're right back to Fanon, right? Fanon spent a lot of time like trying to figure out why is this, that where does this phantasm come from? And I think that this is part of racism. There's a phantasmatic dimension of racism that gets transmitted and incited among those who participate in this way of thinking and living, and it distorts the argument. But it's concealed in the argument. It's at the center of the argument, and it exposes that rational argument as actually being controlled by something which is deeply irrational. So although the black man is accused of being uncontrollably violent, about to turn around and kill, the irrationality is on the side of the person who is projecting this image, and the murderousness belongs to the police, who rely on that phantasmatic image as a justification to kill. So where is the uncontrollable violence in the scene? Right? Is it with the black man running away? Is it with the white policeman with his gun? I mean, and we see this repeated. I mean, now in the US, it's like every 3 or 4 days, another one. Unbelievable scenes, very resonant with the history of slavery. And it's men, women, children. It's not just the black man who was, of course, Fanon's concern. But we do see this. And I think we could also say the same about femicide in various parts of the world. And by femicide, I mean not just the killing of women, but what is the phantasmatic construction of the woman who must die if a man is offended or if a man is angry? What power does she have? What power is being expunged in the course of femicide? And that's another scene where we see that a phantasm has the capacity to orient thought and also to arrive again later in the court of law to excuse and exonerate the one who murders. So I think we have to see that there are these kinds of, I call them demographic fantasies, like this group of people are this way, or they get invested with enormous irrational powers, castrating powers, or um, destructive powers. And I would include as part of femicide, the killing of trans women and travestis, but also I think we need to nuance that by thinking about violence, homophobic violence, which is also gender-based, but may not be exactly femicide, because certainly many men are also attacked precisely for their gender presentation, and many butch or masculine women who continue to understand themselves as women are also attacked precisely for their perceived masculinity and for their departure from the norm. So these are all, I would say, phantasmatic scenes with enormous political consequences, and they're part of the forms of social violence that we're dealing with now.
And you also bring attention to Europe, especially to migration, because you wrote that Europe arises from the false idea that it is a wide continent. And you suggest in a similar way that is not to point the finger at this or that state official institution, at the decision to not to have wanted to send rescue to boats in need, like we said and listened in these years. And as it often done on social networks, so but they grasp the large-scale politics that in fact leaves dying people, which will let them die rather than let them in. So how can Europe, in your opinion, realize this and change this large-scale politics?
Well,
if you think that is there is hope.
Well, you know, it's very complicated now. I see. I mean, it is in part the European Union which has abandoned the migrants on the sea and has agreed to the criminalization of humanitarian workers who seek to save those lives. I feel like that is one of the saddest outcomes of Europe, of the idea of Europe, right? It's sad and cruel and inexcusable. At the same time, I'm also seeing forms of nationalism within Europe, which involve breaking with Europe, right? And they are also anti-migrant and very often very homophobic and transphobic, as we're seeing in Poland, or we're seeing in Hungary and a number of places in Eastern Europe, which are seeking to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention or attack what they understand to be EU norms on issues of gender and sexuality. So, you know, the map is very complex, and I don't pretend to know it well, but I do believe that a humane migration policy is imperative, and that what we're seeing is the abandonment of people, not just because they're migrants, but because they're coming from North Africa, or they're coming from Syria or Turkey or any number of places in the Middle East. And it is a policy of racism which cloaks itself through all kinds of other rationalities. And it does belong to this official and that official who speaks, but they are reproducing this form of thinking, this racist ideology, and they support each other. The more they reproduce it, the more they set precedent, the more they support each other. And you can become extremely racist and still be acceptable to Europe. And that is very, very frightening, as we see when the neo-Nazis storm the German government buildings. I mean, we are in a quite terrible situation, both here and there, and in places like Hong Kong. We could go on.
Yes. And you underline a risk about constituting a group like vulnerable, because when a group is constituted as such, as vulnerable, there is a risk of having a paternalistic attitude towards the people who are part of it, depriving them of all power. So how can we avoid this risk?
Well, I think it's a very big problem for humanitarian efforts. And
Yes.
I have seen that when people want to get asylum, they have to prove that they are intensely vulnerable, which means also that they sometimes have to hide the fact that they are taking steps, or that they have forms of solidarity, or that they are engaged in change. I think we don't need to ask people to dramatize their vulnerability to give them safe treatment. If they are mobilizing against violence, if they're mobilizing against exclusion, that's good. That's incredibly good. But they shouldn't be faulted for mobilizing, right? Oh, that's a sign you're not really vulnerable. And they shouldn't be asked to produce a kind of false picture of who they are. They are disenfranchised. They are vulnerable. They are exposed to all kinds of violence and lack of healthcare and lack of mobility. But at the same time, they are mobilizing. Even to get asylum involves a mobilization of some kind. So what I don't like is the ontologization of the vulnerable. Oh, those are vulnerable, I'm not, right? It's like, no, we're all vulnerable, which is why we need obligations to help each other that are reciprocal and universalizable. Nobody escapes vulnerability. The pandemic surely teaches us that.
Yes, and in this book, you wrote another great foresight, that prejudice against nonviolence depends on the gender distribution of activity and passivity. The first understood as a male prerogative, and the second is so. It
belongs to women.
Yeah. The second as a female prerogative.
Yeah.
How can we realize and make evident the strength and the force of nonviolence?
Yeah. Well, I mean, nonviolence very often involves acting. I mean, going on strike is an action. I mean, some people say it's a non-action. I think it's an action. It's a political action. It takes networking, it takes solidarity, it takes organization. You have to have a press person, you have to have a mediator, you have to decide how to feed each other when you're not getting employment checks. There's a lot of activity involved in that. So we shouldn't think that only acting violently is true action.
Not acting at all. Yeah. Yes.
But also, I think that if we accept that that vulnerability is part of the condition of our existence, that we are vulnerable, we can't decide what affects our body in every instance. We don't know what people will say to us. We don't control our environment perfectly. Then we also accept that we belong to this social situation. We belong to this air. We belong to this environment. In other words, our lives are bound up. We cannot but be vulnerable. But that doesn't mean we're without strength. I mean, strength and vulnerability are not oppositions. And I actually don't even think masculine and feminine are oppositions. I think that there are all kinds of ways of thinking them together, and maybe we need new vocabularies to really understand those combinations.
Yes, I agree. Judith Butler, I love this book, and I think this is one of the more important book you wrote. And one of the most beautiful sentences you wrote in the book is, we don't need to love each other to equally engage in meaningful bonds of solidarity. So the subtitle of this book is an ethical political bind. And what wish would you leave to your Italian readers who want to commit themselves in this direction?
Well, you know, one reason it's an ethical bind is because we understand violence. We're drawn to it. We sometimes really want to commit it, and we do have anger and rage. And nonviolence doesn't mean give up your anger, give up your rage. Don't, you know, many people think nonviolence means staying peaceful or loving everybody. And what I'm trying to say is we don't have to love everybody. We can even hate them, but let's preserve each other's lives, because the minute we start destroying, we allow this world to become more destructive, and
more violent.
And we destroy this world. We destroy the possibility of solidarity. So, you know, even in political groups I'm part of, I don't love everybody who's part of that group. You know, I'm not having them for dinner. I'm not taking walks for them, right? I mean, I'm not finding out when their birthday is. You know, I'm just, you know, I'm on the other side of the room. But we stay in a struggle, in an agonistic struggle, because there's bound to be conflict. And when you stay in the struggle, you find a way to overcome violence in favor of an expanding social, political world where there is a kind of basic commitment, an obligation that I would say is both ethical and political to produce the conditions of a livable life for everyone.
Judith Butler, thank you so much. Thank you for being here, for talking about this book. I invite all Italian readers to read this book, because this is full of foresight about this moment, and it's full of philosophy. It's pure philosophy. So thank you so much. Thank you to Festivaletteratura for this event.
Thank you.
Bye.